Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Kaufmann. He is professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London. He is principally interested in cultural politics, ethnicity, national identity, and religion, and is the author of a book we're going to focus on today, Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. So, Dr. Kaufmann, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having me here, Ricardo. I'm pleased to be here.
Okay, great. So let me first ask you perhaps a basic question. So the title of the book is White Shift. What is
Right.
White Shift? What is the basic thesis of the book?
Well, yeah, there's two sort of broad meanings. One is the decline of white ethnic majorities in Western countries during this century and the kind of politics that that leads to, which is populism and polarization. The second is a longer term. Really, we're looking a century out, which is a shift in the meaning of the white majority moving to a more beige or multiracial type majority ethnicity. So that's a kind of second meaning of white shift. The white shift 2.0, you might say. Most of the book focuses on the first, although a good chunk towards the end focuses on that second meaning of this more melting, Beijing kind of white shift that's going on.
Mhm.
But that we won't see the product of in any serious fashion until the second half of this century and into the 22nd century, really.
Mhm. But the people who identify as whites, I mean, doesn't it change a little bit over time? I mean, perhaps 100 years ago, people who would include in the white ethnicity were not really the same as the ones that we include today. So, for example, I think that in North America, I think sometimes East Asians are already considered white in some places, or
Not really, but I think you're right, though, that there's been a sort of shift. It's important, though, because some of the literature which I'm critical of tends to use this term whiteness, and some of the critical race literature, and suggests that the meaning of white itself, the racial term, shifts a lot, and I'm more skeptical of that. In fact, what I talk about is more the meaning of the ethnic majority. So it would have excluded, let's say, Catholics and Jews, and then after the 1960s, those groups were then part of what was considered to be the ethnic majority. So the ethnic majority was no longer defined as white Anglo-Protestant, but it was now white, which included you could be Catholic or Jewish. Now, what I'm kind of arguing in the book is that in the future, so what happens is that the circle of the ethnic majority, the largest community of common ancestry, was narrower than the racial white group that was recognized as white in law, for example. And Jews and Catholics were always recognized as white in law. So that wasn't the issue. But what happens is the circle of who was a member of the sort of old American or true American kind of ethnic majority was narrowed to only Protestants, and even amongst Protestants excluded generally Germans and Scandinavians. But what happens is you then get an expansion of membership. And what I'm saying in the future is probably the circle of the ethnic majority will become larger than the racial white group. So it'll include people with part European ancestry in it. And so that's kind of the next expansion. But notice that to talk about white expanding, I think, is not necessarily especially accurate. It's not so much a racial expansion as a ethnic boundary expansion.
but I mean, this sort of white identity, I guess we could call it, it's associated with the culture itself, or not?
So yeah, ethnicity refers to a community defined in terms of a myth of believing itself to descend from a common ancestor. Um, And so the relationship to culture, then, it depends, right? So whether it be, say, religion, if we can think of Northern Ireland or India, where religion is the key marker separating the communities of ancestry, but then you can also get skin color, like in the southern United States or South Africa, or you might get language in the Baltic states. So it doesn't necessarily matter what cultural marker you're using, as long as there is a marker that groups can use to tell each other apart. The only complication is sometimes that marker can get really blurry. And so you might have somebody who looks very white, but they say they've got some African American, and so they then are classified and accepted as black. So there is a blurriness at these boundaries. But culture is not primary. I think culture is a sort of signifier and marker of the subjectivity, which is primary. So the subjectivity of thinking you belong to a descent community is the sort of central element of ethnicity.
Mm-hmm. And does this have any effects on a political level? I mean, is it the case that people who share a white identity tend to or are more inclined toward one political pole than the other, or one political party, something like that?
Yeah, there's been a fair bit of work now on the U.S. that shows that those who have for whom white identity is more important to them are more likely to vote Republican, for example, if you just take white Americans, and that's even when you control for their racism or their feelings towards minority groups, independent of that, attachment to being white, for example, is a predictor. Now, I've looked at this in Britain and Canada, and there is not a relationship that I've been able to find between that stronger white identity and voting, say, for the right. And so that's interesting, and it's not definitive yet, but it seems in the U.S. context that racial identity matters. And similarly, if you're not white and you identify with your minority group, you're more likely to vote for the Democrats. But that's only, as far as I can tell, only an American phenomenon thus far. The other thing I should say is that this overwhelmingly the strongest predictor of whether you will identify as, say, white or Hispanic or black is your ancestral identification. So if you're really attached to being Irish or really attached to being German, then you will be much more likely to be attached to being white. So it's kind of a pan-ethnic. It's a second layer. It's like being Portuguese and European. The European layer is the outer layer, and so people are less attached to that, but the strength of attachment tends to be linked to strength of attachment to ancestry.
Mm-hmm. And what are the factors behind the rise of right-wing populism? I mean, because this occurred throughout the world, I guess, particularly in Western Europe, in North America, a little bit in South America as well. So what are the factors behind it?
Well, so I argue in the book very much that the data, the individual level survey data, shows quite clearly that the more cultural psychological questions predict support for Trump and Brexit and the populist right in Europe. And I see Portugal has now entered into the arena with everybody else now. But yeah, so this is so essentially, if you look at, you can take the Trump vote, white Americans, whether you earn a lot of money or a little bit of money, that is, there's almost no difference between wealthier and less wealthy white Americans in whether their likelihood for voting for Trump. Economic factors, whether you're unemployed, lost a job, none of that really matters much. What really matters is your views on questions that psychologists use to tap certain orientations. So, for example, agreement with a statement like, things in Britain were better in the past, or your views on the death penalty. These are all much, much more powerful than income and economic position and class and any of that. Now, the strongest sort of social variable is education, but education is much more tied to cultural outlooks and worldviews than simply the amount of money you make, or even the occupation you have. So what I stress in the book is this is very much about cultural psychological outlooks. And the psychology is key because the degree to which you see difference as messy or as stimulating, or change as exciting or as loss. That is sort of 50% heritable. Twin studies have sort of suggested that. This is a highly heritable general psychological orientation. And you can see correlations between people who say their desks are messy and neat, or people who think there should be a dress code in Wimbledon and tennis, or who think there shouldn't be. Those sorts of questions that actually all connect to views on immigration, views on a lot of things. So there is this general literature on what's called right-wing authoritarianism, which is people like Karen Stenner, the psychologist, have written about, and Jonathan Haidt and others, and suggesting this is quite a deep, a stable psychological disposition in populations, and therefore it's not something that you can simply educate out of somebody. It's sort of quite, you actually have to think about how you're going to craft a message that will appeal to different kinds of psychological types, including that type that really likes the present to be like the past and thinks difference is disorderly. So that's really one of the big challenges, I think, for Western societies who move towards this diversity and change. They've pushed that kind of an intellectual and cultural message, and that works very well for some people, and it works very badly for other people. And I think we're seeing that now manifested in the kind of polarization that's happening, not just in America, actually. I think you can see it happening in other Western Canada, even my own in Canada. You can see the same pattern emerging, even though there hasn't been a Trump or a successful populist party, except for in Quebec. But in the English-speaking part, there hasn't been.
Yeah, and how much should we worry about that political polarization? Do you think that could continue on? I mean, not indefinitely, of course, but it could go on for much longer than it already has, or not?
Yeah, I think it is going to get worse, because I think the forces that are driving it, which are first of all, the growing ethnic diversification of populations, and secondly, overlaid on top of that is a clash of values. So one part of the society is deeply invested, particularly the highly educated, what a recent book called Brexitland refers to as identity liberals. That worldview of sort of celebrating diversity and almost sacralizing diversity and change as sacred values that you can't be against has become, I would argue, a kind of political religion, and is actually leading to a backlash, in addition to the sort of backlash that's caused by growing diversity and the question of how to deal with that diversity. You have overlaid on this now a secondary backlash, and so what you get is the sort of diversity change ideology, which I call left modernism, which is actually a fusion of liberal and left-wing ideas, then hits a backlash from, particularly in the US, from the sort of populist right, and then the identity liberals then react against the populist right. So you almost have this recursive process. And so it's hard to know how we get out of this. I think there is a way out of it, which involves political toleration and understanding that people are not all the same, and you can't get everybody to think exactly the same. But we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. And should we worry about white supremacist political groups? Because, I mean, at least in the media, people talk a lot about them and they focus a lot on them and say that perhaps, I mean, we should worry about these groups and also the ones that react to them, like, for example, in the US, Antifa and groups like that. Should we worry about them, or are they simply fringe groups that do not represent society?
Well, they are fringe groups, but obviously anybody who has an extremist ideology that, can turn violent and that has committed violent acts, you have to, as a society, police them. And, we saw Breivik, in Norway. And so we that is one example, or there's Brendan Tarrant in New Zealand. So yeah, far-right terrorism is real, and I think it might even increase. And so it's certainly something that the security services need to be on top of. Uh, but like any of these things, it's similarly with Islamist terrorism or IRA terrorism. You want to have vigilance, but you can't allow that then to lead to mission creep, where you're actually then threatening free speech and using that as a sort of stalking horse for authoritarianism. You have to define very tightly the rules of engagement and when you're going to arrest somebody and not see, it's a bit like if somebody happens to be a very conservative Muslim, who may have beliefs about, separation of the sexes, and that's something I deplore. But on the other hand, they have a right to their beliefs, and that's not that I wouldn't call a violent threat to society. So you have to be able to draw those lines without getting into a moral panic about some of these things.
Do we know if the migration crisis played the role in the rise of the political polarization we've been witnessing in recent years?
The migration crisis very clearly, I think, and there's an excellent paper by James Dennison and Andrew Geddes on this, that they've looked at 10 West European countries. There is, in 9 out of those 10 countries between about 2006 and 2016, I believe, or it's 2007 to 16, they showed a statistically significant link between increases in migration numbers, the increased salience of immigration as a political issue, and the rise in populist right voting. Now, that salience issue is very important. So when I say salience, I mean not that people who said immigration should be kept the same or increased suddenly changed to say immigration should be reduced. In fact, people's attitudes, which are heavily tied to these psychological dispositions, are not that movable, even with numbers. What really does change, however, is people who said, yes, I want immigration reduced, but it's my number 5 issue after the economy and healthcare. All of a sudden, now it's their number 1 issue. So the rising numbers correlates with an increased prioritization amongst the restrictionist voters, who typically form a majority, slight majority of the electorate in many Western countries. So it rises up their agenda, and you see that in country after country. Almost every country you see as the numbers are going up in the migration crisis to a peak in late 2015. You can see the salience in the Eurobarometer, immigration rising, and many populist right parties very clearly with, say, the AfD in Germany. It's someone did a paper looking at monthly refugee arrivals and opinion polling and showed a correlation. So yeah, I think, and similarly in Britain with the lead up to Brexit, you can see the same pattern in net migration figures and the salience of immigration. And so that's really, on the demand side, really key to understanding the rise of the populist right. But of course, you're also getting then a response on the other side from that identity liberal side, which is sort of younger, but particularly the highly educated metropolitan. Metropolitan is less important, but they are also then looking at the rise of the populist right and reacting to that, which is, I think, important, because it then raises this question of, is this racism and therefore morally beyond the pale? And then, of course, that then leads to a backlash from the populist right voters who say, you called us deplorables, or, I think David Cameron called UKIP fruitcakes and closet racists. Whatever the terminology is, that's then going to sort of blow back as well. And in fact, we've seen some psychology papers that have sort of shown this blowback effect in experimental work when you sort of call one of Donald Trump's policies racist versus just bad, let's say. When you use the term racist, that sort of increases support for those policies amongst some voters. And so you get this reactance effect that occurs. So I think we're in this spiral where we're getting each side kind of reacting to the other. And that's leading to this polarization, which is sort of crystallized by cultural issues, particularly immigration. Also, increasingly, the sort of political correctness issue, and that's Trump used quite powerfully in the 2016 election. Both political correctness and the immigration and lack of border control were really the central issues for people voting for Trump. And also in the primary when he emerged as the Republican leader, which is critical to explaining, of course, this whole process, because it's that primary where you could see these issues. So it was the issues of immigration and political correctness that really separated Republican primary voters who voted for Trump from those who voted for Ted Cruz or for Kasich or any of the other candidates.
Mm-hmm. Did the economic crisis of 2008 play any role in the rise of political polarization?
Yeah, my view on this is, and it's somewhat heretical, but I think it's basically had almost no effect. Inequality is undoubtedly rising, and that's a big problem, and it's something we need to fix. But this is not behind right-wing populism. It's arguably playing a role with respect to left-wing populism. Sanders, for example, Syriza, and Podemos. But in terms of the populist right, you can look at you can look at support for populist right parties in Western Europe, and it doesn't budge really. I mean, there are a few. You can look at Golden Dawn. There are a few little isolated examples of where you might say this is the timing of this seems to have something to do with the economic crisis. But if you look at the broad sweep of Western Europe, really nothing. And similarly, with regard to immigration attitudes, there's been papers that have shown that using panel data methods that the economic crisis has no real effect on immigration attitudes either. So it's kind of, and I would almost go as far as to argue that when people were really concerned about the economy, they're less concerned about immigration, not more concerned. Immigration, relative to other issues, has a lower priority. It's like right now, because of COVID and the economic problems, actually the immigration issue has a little bit lower priority in the voting amongst voters, and that's actually makes it much harder for populist right parties to attain the kind of levels of support that they had, say, in that key period of 2014 to 2017, let's say, or 2018.
Mm-hmm. And do we know why there's been a rise in populism, particularly on the right, or at least the right has been more effective in perhaps responding to people's fears, I guess, and that's not really been the case on the left side of the aisle, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I would argue, if you look at, again, the survey data, 99% of Sweden Democrat voters say immigration should be reduced. 100% of AfD voters in Bavaria, said, agreed with the statement, Germany is gradually losing its culture. By far the strongest predictor in almost every case is views on immigration and views around culture and national identity questions. And so this is by far and away the main reason we see the activity more on the right in terms of populism. Now, of course, we have growing inequality, and we have mainstream parties have lost connection to the population because people are much less likely to be members of their local chapter of their party. They're less likely to be in a union, and all of those things do matter, and they do contribute to fragmentation generally. So that's happening generally, and yes, that benefits the populist left to some degree as well. But the reason that the populist right is doing better than the populist left, in my view, in Western Europe has to do with this ethnic change migration factor and not to do with the economic factors. Now, Eastern Europe is a different case in some regards. I mean, the issue in Eastern Europe is partly the culture. Again, I think it comes partly down to a different political culture there, which is in some ways just less liberal, broadly speaking. So if you look at Germany, you can see that AfD voting is higher in East Germany. In East Germany, views on immigration don't matter as much for picking out an AfD voter, whereas in West Germany, they matter hugely. And so that's, and so I think the West-East difference, so the Eastern countries it's the Eastern countries that are inside the European Union also, where they can sort of whip up this fear about we're going to be next, we're going to look like Germany, Austria next. So it's not Moldova and Ukraine and Serbia. It's not the countries that are outside the EU that are really not potentially even exposed to migration and multiculturalism and so on. It's generally the countries inside the EU. So I think the Eastern European situation is a little different, but also is related in a second-order way to the migration issue, but not in a first-order way the way it is in the West.
Mm-hmm. But this rise in the populist right-wing parties, I mean, was it also a reaction to Muslim terrorism or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can certainly see countries that have had, France or Britain, where Muslim terrorism was an issue, but then there's plenty of places, Austria, and there are plenty of countries that have had strong populist right movements where the Islam issue hasn't been the issue. I mean, if you look at Austria, up until 2008, and certainly under Haider, and no one talked or cared about Islam. And even in Hungary, if you look at Hungary, Jobbik or any of these, Islam was not really an issue. In some ways, they kind of felt close to the Turks for sort of ethnic reasons. So it seems, I think the Islam thing is not the driver. I think it can be an additional factor. And I think some research suggests there is a group of people who are, particularly, you can see there's a certain proportion of gay voters and Jewish voters are voting for Le Pen or have voted for the populist right in France. And some of that might be down to this idea of fear of Islam as a threat to liberty. But I think that is the bulk of the explanation is still down to this sort of what's known as right-wing authoritarianism. I don't necessarily like the use of that term since it's a bit inaccurate, but basically people who want want stability and order, and who want a change to slow down, who want difference to be less, so that is the sort of principal, I would say, attitudinal driver. So I think the Muslim or Islamist terrorist issue certainly was a factor to some degree in some countries, but now that that's ebbing away, looks like it's ebbing away as a major issue, I don't think that's fundamentally going to change the picture very much.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Western countries have been dealing with the migration crisis in a proper way? And if so, how are they dealing with it? I mean, what are the kinds of strategies that they are adopting?
Well, yeah, you had, of course, with Merkel's opening to the migrants, you had this big opening, over 1 million people show up. Now you have a closing down and an attempt to do a deal, with Turkey and with Libya to try and to repatriate the migrants before they can get to Europe and make claims on the legal system and get entrenched. And I think that's sort of the approach that was taken. My own view is that I'm not convinced that this is the best approach. I mean, I think sort of signaling to refugees that they can come to Europe, I think that was actually a big mistake in my view, and this has sort of been behind the rise of the populist right in Europe. I think a better move, I mean, what I talk about in the book is, clearly we want to be able to save as many lives as we possibly can. We don't want people risking their life. We don't want people being killed in Syria. So we need to actually house and feed and allow refugees to have as normal a life as possible. But I think the link between taking refuge and finding a refuge and having permanent settlement and citizenship, that link needs to be actually broken so that you would be able to get refuge and safety. And from there, you can then apply for citizenship or perhaps come in under a refugee quota that's a fixed number each year. But you have to disincentivize people from taking a chance and crossing, in many cases, dangerously and losing lives. So I think that the policy of sort of not encouraging people to risk it is a good policy, but I think it's a bad policy whenever you incentivize people to risk it, because inevitably you're going to have to clamp down on it somehow, and I just think it's been chaotic in terms of how it's been managed.
Do you think that migrants could be a good solution to fight back against the lower fertility rates we have in the West? Because, I mean, over time, I think that social security for nationals, I mean, will become an issue if we have less people that are working and more old people in our countries.
Yeah, I don't think it is a solution, and I think demographers will be, pretty clearly show you that the issue is you almost need a kind of exponentially rising number of immigrants to keep your age structure the same. Like if you wanted to maintain the same share of the population aged, let's say 15 to 65, or whatever what you think of as your productive age range, because immigrants come in, they have kids, their birth rates will be falling down to the same level as everybody else's. They age too. In order to keep this thing going, you have to keep pumping in. I think there was a report of the European Union that suggested that Europe would have to increase its intake to in the tens of millions instead of, a million a year. So many times the current intake, and to keep increasing that in order to maintain that age structure. I just think that's not. So immigration is not a solution to the age structure problem. I think that you're going to have some immigration. There always will be immigration, but I don't think that's going to solve what is fundamentally a problem of having fertility at a replacement rate. And also, by the way, there are many other things you can do so you can better utilize your whatever part of your workforce, say women, say older people, are not being effectively utilized. You can mechanize. So there are many different things that are much more consequential for dealing with the aging problem than immigration. And also, of course, as this book really shows, immigration is in a way probably the most politically divisive thing that can be done. And it's not, if it were very effective, then I would probably say yes, okay. But in fact, it's not demographically going to solve your problem. So and yet you do see this narrative trotted out, which is really, it's simply untrue. So it's quite interesting that it persists as a narrative.
And do you think that because we have increasing levels of economic inequality in the West, we will have to adopt some sort of redistribution approaches here or not?
Yeah, I do think that you can't just have this runaway economic inequality and particularly the top 1%, 10%, the rising share of the national income they seem to be acquiring. Yeah, something needs to be done there in terms of trying to. Yeah, obviously taxing is not going to change that picture, but I think some way of having broader based economic growth is. I'm not an expert. I'm not enough of an expert to know what that kind of industrial policy would be. The only thing I would say is it's probably not going to make an enormous difference to the issues driving the populist right, because it's not fundamentally about economic position, and it's only very marginally about these sorts of economic anxieties. And I think there's been, if you look geographically and you say, oh, the areas that are struggling economically have a higher vote for Le Pen or for Trump or whatever. This is actually something called the ecological fallacy, where you're looking at aggregate unit data, which is very misleading, that in fact, it's just because those areas correlate with, say, older populations, fewer minorities, fewer university-educated people. That's why they look to be, that explains the vast, vast majority of why they are much more populist right voting. So it's a kind of an error that I think a lot of analysts make. Whereas, for example, if you look at the city of London, if you take white working class UK-born Londoners, they were as likely to vote for Brexit as a white working-class native-born person in another part of England, in rural England, for example. So it's not so much the economy and the culture of a big city or a smaller place that matters as much as simply what kinds of people you have in these areas.
Mhm. And because many of these populist right-wing movements we are seeing nowadays have also anti-globalist narratives, do you think that things like the European Union could definitely fail in the future?
Well, so this is a tricky one because in Britain, the UK Independence Party was able to link the immigration issue, which voters really cared about, with the issue of the European Union, which voters really didn't care that much about. Yes, they didn't. Most voters probably in Britain. Britain has long had a cooler feeling towards the European Union, but people didn't see Europe in their daily lives. This wasn't a big issue for them. And it was only an issue when Farage was able to say the reason we have high immigration is because we have a free movement with the European Union. Even though actually, more immigration was coming from outside the EU than from inside the EU for most of the period up to the Brexit vote. But that association could be made. And so you can see that the link between immigration attitudes and attitudes towards Europe, which is essentially not there at all in 1975 when Britain renews its or becomes a member of the EEC, or maybe they renewed their membership. I can't remember exactly. You go forward from 1975 to 2016, what was essentially no correlation at all is now a very tight correlation. And so that's the case in Britain. It's also to some degree the case in some other countries, particularly in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, I think the Netherlands. It's not as strong a correlation. And I think if you take a case like Hungary with, Orban, they're still reasonably pro-European because they don't associate Europe with the same things that a UKIP voter associates Europe with. So there's actually a kind of a right-wing interpretation of the European Union as a kind of fortress against the non-European world. And in fact, it's not clear. And the EU has different faces. It has a kind of liberal cosmopolitan face, but it also has a kind of Frontex border control face. And I think the EU has changed. It's no longer quite as sort of, if you like, globalist and cosmopolitan. It's more pragmatic. It's more, it's balancing off what is, after all, a much larger populist right bloc now in European Parliament. So it's kind of got to be more attentive to member state concerns. So I don't think this issue will necessarily destroy the European Union. I think it's just a challenge, but I think the EU can manage it just like it kind of muddles through on these other economic challenges between Southern and Northern Europe. I think similarly it can probably muddle through this challenge as well.
Yeah. Do you think that somewhere in the future we will ever be able to live without borders?
Without borders at all? Well, I mean, it's technically possible if in a world where countries are very equal economically, then, if you look at Western Europe, there's some demand for people to move around, but it's not very large. Once countries reach a certain level, the pressures to leave tend to weaken. And so under those conditions, yeah, I could maybe see a world where, I mean, you probably would still need to probably police, if criminals or terrorists were coming in. There probably will have to be some kinds of controls, but you might be able to get closer to a borderless situation, yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is a controversial question, but do we know if more diverse societies are less cohesive?
I think the evidence is fairly strong that they are when you control for everything else, right? So it's complicated because successful societies attract immigration and become diverse, right? And so that complicates the relationship. But if you look, for example, certainly if you look at the small scale level of small scale communities, there have been papers that show that, for example, attachment to community declines, again, not amongst everybody. When it gets more diverse, it'll decline amongst the part of the population that is wired, if you like, or oriented towards order and towards seeing change as loss and difference as disorder, they will reduce their attachments. And of course, there's a big literature in economics, which you may know, Easterly and Levine and others. So something called ethnic fractionalization, which is the sort of chance that any two individuals will be of the same ethnic group if you randomly pick them out of a population. So that measure of ethnic fractionalization is linked to sort of slower development, for example. It's not linked necessarily to more violent conflict. Violent conflict is highest where you have sort of 2 or 3 equal-sized groups, and you have what's called ethnic polarization. But you will get sort of, it's more difficult to sort of get agreement over where to locate the hospital. Is it my ethnic area or their ethnic area? And so there's this literature on ethnic fractionalization and economic development and provision of public goods. And yes, I do think that is a factor. Now, of course, so all other things being equal, in a ethnically diverse society, politics is more likely to be to follow along ethnic lines. A place like Guyana, for example, or Trinidad, or places that are radically ethnically decentered are more likely to have political parties that will tend to be ethnically constituted rather than ideologically constituted. But having said that, I mean, it is not the case that a diverse society can't work and will be at each other's throat. No, I mean, clearly, Switzerland and Mauritius and there are successful multi-ethnic societies. I think what I suggest in the book is that it's also a question of, there is this issue of societies that have a sort of ethnic core that assimilates people, have a melting pot, if you like the US, Canada, and I'd argue even Western European countries are going to be moving in this direction, so that actually the assimilation reduces the diversity, the immigration increases the diversity. It's all about calibrating the rates of these different things so that you actually keep solidarity at a sufficient level. I mean, that's sort of what you're always going to have ethnic minorities, you're always going to have immigration, but it's all about the rate, and it's about keeping the balance, really. And now it may be the case that, so it takes a while. It can often take generations for the melting to occur. So in the U.S. case, it took sort of from the late 19th century till the 1960s and 70s for the European ethnic groups to leave their ethnic neighborhoods to intermarry heavily across ethnic lines, right? And once that happens, you can turn the immigration taps on again. But during the period where this process is taking place and the diversity levels are rising, my view is you probably need to think about slowing down the inflow until such a time, not halting, but just coming to a rate of immigration that the society agrees that is comfortable with. And then once that assimilation takes place, then you can sort of increase the rate again. But it's a sort of nonlinear function, I would argue.
Right. Does multiculturalism work, and are multicultural societies the same as multi-ethnic societies?
Well, there's a difference between multi-ethnic, which is simply a demographic cultural reality on the ground, and multiculturalism, which is a political philosophy and policy. So multiculturalism would tend to recognize groups as the constituent units of a society, build that into the political system. Northern Ireland and Lebanon, for example, in Northern Ireland, you can't get legislation passed unless it has 40% support in both communities. And in Lebanon, also there's a rotating, the executive, I think the president, the prime minister has to be, one of them is a Christian, one is a Sunni, one is a Shia, it has to rotate. So that is sort of a group-based view of society, and that's necessary when you have a deeply divided society. That's probably what you need to do, like Northern Ireland. But the question is, in a society that is fundamentally not that way, when you adopt this sort of a policy, I think it can hinder social integration. I think a better way to go is to more or less sort of recognize that assimilation is voluntary, not state-led, not forced, but voluntary assimilation is more likely going to be the pattern, and therefore you don't actually need to bring in a group rights-based constitution and regime. That's necessary for deeply divided societies, but not, I would argue, for Western societies that happen to have immigration. Because the other thing is that one of the reasons you need multiculturalism is because of typically native minorities that have land claims and political claims, whereas immigrant minorities tend not to make those political. They're not going to separate. You won't get Chinese Americans, declaring that they're separating from the United States. So there are all kinds of different dynamics that are distinct for immigrant groups compared to indigenous or native ethnic communities.
Mm-hmm. To deal with immigration, do you think that there would be any universal solutions that would work for every country, or should we approach it on a case-by-case basis?
I think there are probably general principles that work. One principle is, I think that it's difficult to say. I mean, I think there's some evidence from places like South Africa where maybe the economic factors are more important. But certainly all the evidence, the survey evidence I've seen in European countries is that these cultural psychological factors are the key. And therefore, I think calibrating the speed of the immigration to society's capacity to absorb it and comfort, the cultural comfort is, I think, the key really going forward. In all Western societies have to think about that issue of solidarity, diversity, knowing that their populations consist of not just people who like diversity and see it as interesting, but which they do, and then that group does exist and is important, but also groups who see who are attached to the country as they know it, who want change to be slower, who see difference as in some way disorderly, and I think that has to be seen as a valid outlook and not pathologized. So this is part of the problem is, now, of course, it is pathological like anything if it becomes extreme, if you want no immigration, if you want some kind of homogenous society. But I think it's quite a mistake to sort of take what for many people is quite a nuanced view. They just want things slower. It's a question of faster, slower, shades of gray. It's not open versus closed. Whereas there's a tendency amongst people on the people on the open side, if you like, who are pro-immigration, to think anyone who wants it slower is essentially just wants to kick everybody who's not white out of the country, which is collapsing complexity into this very simplistic narrative. And it's just not true. I mean, if we look at the survey data again, there are the number of even populist right party voters who want zero immigration, who don't believe in intermarriage, who hold a view that you have to be white to be French or British. That is extremely small. It's sort of in single digits in most cases. And so I think it's to try and caricature an entire half of society or whatever is holding this exclusionary view, I think is just fundamentally dishonest. It's kind of a sort of narrative trick that's been used and is ultimately leading to more blowback and polarization. So there's going to have to be some sort of mutual recognition, and that each side is, and likewise that the people who want more, they're not globalist traitors either. It's okay to be a cosmopolitan. That also has to be recognized, that somebody wants to be a globalist, that's fine too. So there has to be tolerance on both sides, and I think it's getting over that cultural divide is really the challenge, I think, going forward.
Mm-hmm. So I have a final question here,
Yeah.
and I hope it will be a teaser for a second interview, because this is a very complex topic, and if I remember correctly, you have an entire book wrote on it. So the relationship between religion and demography. If we look at the data, it seems that religious people have higher birth rates than non-religious people. So do you think that anywhere in the future not mainstream, sorry, religion could become mainstream in the West again?
The short answer to you is yes, because nowhere in the world where you don't have non-religious populations in the world anywhere that really have an above replacement. That is, have a fertility rate above 2.1 children per woman. And if you go, the sort of wealthier and more economically advanced the society, the more religion and religiosity in particular matter for determining fertility. Whereas in the poorer countries, it doesn't matter so much. And economic factors might play a bigger role. But in the wealthier countries, you have what's known as the second demographic transition model, where it is more cultural factors that influence whether people have more or fewer children. And what that means is all of the West and East Asia and where you have this, and increasingly now Latin America, where you have this below replacement fertility, who is going to be remaining, right, it's an interesting question. I know Paul Moreland, who's working on a book on this, where essentially he talks about this concept of postmodern demography, where it's going to be these groups such as these world-denying religious sects, such as the Amish and Hutterites and ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are increasingly going to make up a larger share, and even people who are just committed practicing members of Abrahamic religions. They have now got between a quarter and a half child fertility advantage. If you compare sort of practicing Catholic white French women with sort of non-religious white French women, you have, something on the order of, I think, a quarter or a half child. And the question then becomes, well, so you have this birth rate advantage amongst the religious, and particularly the conservatively religious. What happens to their children? To what extent do the children then leave the religion and join into the sort of secular pool, if you like, in which case you might have a steady state system where, yes, the religious have more kids, but enough of them secularized to maintain the secular population. I've kind of done some projections with some demographers where we were sort of thinking that around 2050, the numbers kind of look like around 2050 you'd see a bottoming out of the secularization trend in say, Europe and the United States. It's already kind of bottomed out in the Protestant countries of Europe, not Britain, but Scandinavia and the Netherlands. But if you look at some of the, what's happening in Israel, for example, Israel is sort of the most advanced case of this demographic return of religion, where the society's become far more religious, and the reason is almost entirely demographic. It was founded as a more or less secular Zionist state, and the secular Zionist population is essentially being outnumbered by the ultra-Orthodox, who have something like 3 to 4 times as many kids, and these strict religions are very good at keeping the children in the fold. You can't just leave, because then you cut yourself off from your family. And so, yeah, they are a third from a few percentage points in 1960, they're now a third of the Jewish school children. And they're, in North America and Britain, the ultra-Orthodox are projected to be a majority of observant Jews by 2050, from what is, again, a few percentage points. I mean, this is a sort of radical transformation. The Jews are an extreme case, because the secular Jews in the diaspora have a really low birth rate and have outmarriage and all kinds of things. But 2050, if we're looking at a Jewish community in Britain and the U.S. that's going to be predominantly ultra-Orthodox, I mean, that's just an enormous change. And the U.S. the U.S. will be next, I guess. If you take the Amish, the ultra-Orthodox and the Mormons, and I think I did a calculation at current growth rates, you would have something like 300 million Amish in the sort of middle of the 23rd century. Now, of course, that's a long time, but they've been keeping this reproduction rate up for 100 years. What's going to stop that? That's a question we might want to ask at a time when everyone else's birth rates are well below replacement. is to say, is there any scenario under which society doesn't become more religious, looking out a century or two? What would it take? You can see China saying to religious people, you're stopping at 1 or 2, but in a liberal democratic society, it's much harder to see how that would work.
Right. Okay, so just before we go, where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, the best thing is to go to my website, which is www.sneps.net, which is SNEPS.net, and yeah, that you can find most of what I'm doing on there.
Right. Okay. So, guys, the book is again Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Dr. Kaufmann, thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ricardo. All the best.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've been doing this channel for 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you who support the show that it's been running for so long. And so I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1 would already be a great help. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Perarga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan V, Salanian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henry Kalenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodranco, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, my producers, Izar Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Elian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.